I'm Alan Spears with Occupy Democrats, and we have to have a little chat about the deceptive and insidious nature of the Republicans, and especially the Trump family. Now, one of the most challenging things about covering some of these stories that we're going to be talking about today is the fact that so many of these far-right Republicans, so many of these MAGA nutcases weave lies and insane amounts of disinformation in with elements of the truth. Now, this is hardly a new tactic for them, but oftentimes their lies are so egregious or so exaggerated that the moment they speak them, you know for a fact that they're lying. Some of these Republicans who, aren't Marjorie Taylor Greene or Donald Trump, they actually can come off sounding pretty reasonable and pretty rational. Now, sometimes you can have Republicans like J.D. Vance from Ohio who, on their face, when they go to do these interviews on Fox, they sound somewhat reasonable, and on their face, what they say you might find yourself agreeing with. But then you'll have people like Donald Trump Jr. who take these clips and repurpose them and make them into these less than veiled threats. Now, Vance went on to Laura Ingraham's show on Fox News to discuss the news that the House voted to hold Merrick Garland in contempt. Now, the House's vote to hold Garland in contempt is a whole other video. I actually want us to focus in on some of the things that Vance and Ingraham discuss towards the tail end of their show. And of course, being on Fox News, you can absolutely imagine how they are going to take a story and twist it to their own narrative and just outright lie to the viewers. It's important to remember that Fox News is in fact not an actual news network. They had to defend this point in court. Now, Trump Jr., much like his father, is incapable of anything close to subtlety. And when he decided to repost or retweet this video from Vance's interview, it took on an entirely new meaning. Trump Jr., much like his father, is a petty man that is seeking vengeance on those who have wronged him and his family. I want you to take a look at this clip from J.D. Vance's interview with the idea that Trump Jr. reposted this under a bit of a different context and connotation. Take a look and see for yourself.
Why was it important that Merrick Garland be held in contempt today?
Well, first, Laura, if you break the law, you actually have to suffer some consequences for it. We have Steve Bannon being thrown in prison because he was in contempt of Congress. You, of course, have multiple other Republican officials who have had contempt of Congress used to weaponize our justice system against political enemies. And then, of course, you have, remember, Eric Holder in the Obama administration. He was in contempt of Congress. They did nothing. Now Merrick Garland is in contempt of Congress. And I think it's important for Republicans to say that if you guys try to weaponize the political system against your enemies, then we're actually going to follow the law. We're going to do what we have to do, and you're going to suffer consequences for breaking the law.
But what did Holder suffer?
Nothing.
I mean, isn't he speaking at Harvard tonight? I'm just making it up, but like he's not suffered at all. Probably gotten up to speaking fees.
This is unfortunately the standard, Laura, that too many establishment Republicans have allowed. That Democrats are allowed to break the law, no consequences. That has to stop. And if we've learned anything from the lawfare against Donald Trump, we have to learn that if less Republicans fight back against this stuff, it's going to keep on happening.
Did you catch that? Right there at the end, that mask Vance has been wearing just slowly slipped away for a moment. Okay, so let's tackle Vance's insidious interview one chunk at a time. So at the front of that interview, Vance said that if you break the law, you should have to suffer the consequences of doing so. And I think on its face, we can all agree with that. If there is a law that you are bound to follow or an action you are simply prohibited from doing by law, you are going to suffer the consequences of that action. Now, with regards to Merrick Garland's, this is where it again gets a little more complicated. Now, to briefly summarize a very large story, Attorney General Merrick Garland refused to turn over audio tapes of President Biden during a special investigation. Now, this investigation was meant to determine if President Biden had mishandled classified or sensitive information. However, this investigation into Biden ended earlier this year because they had nothing. And even though Garland was subpoenaed by Congress to testify, President Biden had already asserted executive privilege over these tapes and over these investigations. And to be quite frank, these Republicans are subpoenaing and trying to hold Garland in contempt, more than likely as retaliation to the Democrats and the investigation surrounding Jim Jordan, as well as the other Republicans in the January 6th investigation. Jim Jordan's, by the way, is also over 700 days, I think, at this point, past his subpoena. So really what this is a ploy by the Republicans to try to muddy the waters. But that is just one of several lies that Vance was talking about in his interview. Vance also mentioned the former Attorney General Eric Holder, who served under President Obama. Now, I really don't have the time to dive into everything surrounding Holder and his contempt of Congress. However, the short of it is that Holder was involved with a special operation with the ATF known as Operation Fast and Furious. Essentially, this operation was meant to track illegal purchases of firearms, but the operation went horribly wrong and actually resulted in the death of a Border Patrol agent. Holder, along with numerous others, had to testify multiple times before Congress and effectively answer for their mishandling of this operation. Now, there was a motion to attempt to hold Eric Holder in contempt of Congress. However, that motion didn't pass. Holder testified numerous times and provided the documents required for the subpoena. Additionally, the failure of this operation hounded and overshadowed Holder the rest of his service. All that is to say that Vance is absolutely lying when he says that Holder suffered no consequences or got off scot-free. That is simply not true. Now that you have the actual context for the interview with Vance, let's set that aside and realize what Trump Jr. is actually saying with this. Trump Jr. is referring to those last few lines of Vance's interview that unless Republicans stand up and fight, this sort of thing is going to happen again. This is absolutely Trump Jr. being about as subtle as a brick to the head, saying that he and the rest of his family and the rest of this MAGA movement are going to start fighting, perhaps even more than they already have, back against the Democrats and to back these systems of justice that are holding the Trump family accountable for their crimes. And let's be very clear, Trump Jr., along with his father and the rest of the Trumps and the MAGA movement, are keen on stoking the fires of hatred and resentment in their base. While perhaps they can't directly call for action from their base and ask them to act on their behalf without drawing some pretty dire consequences, they can at the very least make these sort of veiled threats, these veiled messages of a response from the right if justice is continued to carry out against his father and the Trump family. And Trump Jr. and the rest of them know that their backs are kind of up against the wall at this point, and the room to maneuver and wiggle out of justice is quickly closing in. They are absolutely not going to go down without a fight, and whether that requires them to make threats, be it veiled or overt, they will say and do whatever they need to avoid any semblance of punishments for their crimes. And you really don't need to look very far to see that Trump Jr. is just as big of a liar as his father and pretty much all of the Trump family. Hell, he lied about the crowd coming out to support Donald Trump, and it was footage from President Biden's motorcade passing through New York. Trump Jr. is absolutely taking a page out of his father's playbook and lying about President Biden, Attorney General Merrick Garland, our justice system, the list goes on. He's absolutely a man that stokes division, confusion, and hatred in an attempt to obscure he and his father's attempts at political and financial gain. Trump Jr.'s actions and words absolutely need to be kept an eye on and scrutinized at every possible moment because he is using the words of J.D. Vance and others to make these veiled threats and basically threaten vengeance if any sort of accountability is held against his father. Trump Jr. and the rest of his family are absolutely the greatest threats to our democracy and this great country, and we absolutely need to scrutinize every action and word they take to ensure we mitigate the damage they can inflict.